I remember that night as clearly as if it happened yesterday, even though I am 26 now and I was only 12 at the time. My parents had gone out and left me at home with my 18-year-old brother, Zach, who promised to stay, but then told me he was heading out with friends and made me swear not to tell our parents, which I agreed to because I trusted him and enjoyed the idea of having the big house to myself. At first it felt exciting, but that excitement faded quickly when I decided to watch a scary movie alone in the den, a choice I soon regretted as every creak in the floor, every gust of wind against the windows, and every click of the fridge made my heart race. Halfway through the movie, completely on edge, I turned off the TV and ran upstairs to my room, brushed my teeth as fast as I could, and tried to distract myself by playing Call of Duty Zombies on my Xbox 360 until I lost track of time. When I finally decided to sleep, I heard the front door close and assumed Zach had returned, but the sounds downstairs went on far too long and felt wrong, with soft footsteps and dull thuds that made my stomach twist. I looked out the window expecting to see his car, but the driveway was empty, and panic fully set in when I realized I had no phone and no easy way to call for help. I locked my bedroom door, knowing how useless the lock really was, and hid inside the small crawling closet, praying I was just being paranoid. Moments later, I heard someone trying the door, then opening it and walking into my room, moving things around while I sat frozen in fear, barely breathing, convinced the closet door could open at any second. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the footsteps finally left, and I stayed hidden for nearly 2 more hours until I heard Zach shouting my name and storming into my room. When he angrily demanded to know why I was in the closet and what had happened to his room, I knew for certain the person in the house had not been him. Once I explained everything, we searched the house and found drawers pulled out and electronics missing, clear signs of a break-in. Zach called the police, who took a report and told us to wait for our parents. When they arrived around 4 in the morning, my father was furious and struck Zach for leaving me alone and the front door unlocked, while my mother hugged me and told me she was just grateful I was safe. Zach was later forced to repay the stolen items over time, but I was not punished, only left shaken and deeply scarred by the experience. A fear that stayed with me for years and still returns whenever I remember hiding in that closet, listening to someone walk around my room, unsure if I would make it out alive. When I was very young, not even old enough for kindergarten, I lived with my grandparents after my parents separated, and although my father worked in a nearby town and visited on weekends, I was usually surrounded by family because my uncle also lived with us. I had always been taught never to open the door for strangers, but we lived in a small, quiet town where everyone knew one another. And there was a neighbor, whom I will call David, who often came by to watch hockey or wrestling, drink beers with my uncle, help my grandpa with yard work, or even haul a moose into the shed after a hunt, so he felt familiar and safe to me. One night, I was briefly left home alone while my grandma was at bingo and my grandpa went to pick her up, reminding me before he left not to open the door for strangers, which I promised as I stayed behind to watch cartoons. Not long after the truck pulled away and the house fell silent, someone knocked on the door, and when I asked who it was, I heard David's familiar voice saying he had just seen my grandpa leave. He also claimed he knew my uncle was out drinking and asked to come inside. I told him I was not allowed to open the door for strangers, but he insisted he was not a stranger, and in my child's mind, that made sense, so I unlocked the door. David loomed over me, clearly drunk, swaying and slurring his words, and when he stepped inside and grabbed my shoulders, I instinctively backed away, still not fully alarmed because I had seen my uncle drunk many times before. When I told him he could wait in the kitchen while I watched TV, his grip tightened. His voice turned angry, and fear washed over me as he dragged me into the kitchen, grabbed a large knife and pressed it against my stomach, asking if I wanted to be stabbed and threatening to cut my tongue or throat if I cried, even dragging the dull blade across my neck to show he meant it. Just then, I heard my grandparents' truck pull into the driveway and relief surged through me, but David clamped a hand over my mouth, as my grandma walked in and immediately screamed for my grandpa when she saw him holding me at knife point. My grandpa burst through the door in fury, charged at David without hesitation, and after a brief, violent struggle, David shoved me to the floor before my grandma grabbed me and shielded my eyes, telling me I was safe while the sounds of the fight continued. Moments later, my grandpa forced David out the door, shouting for him to never return and slamming it shut. As I grew older, I realized David had waited deliberately, knowing exactly when my uncle and grandma would be gone and watching for my grandpa to leave. And years later, while reminiscing with my grandma after my grandpa's funeral, I brought up that night and called him a hero, only for her to grow uneasy and remind me that my grandpa had gone hunting later that same night, something he rarely did. They never called the police, and I never saw David again. And knowing how respected my grandpa was in the community, how close he was with local officers, and how normal it would have looked for him to drive out of town late at night with a bloody tarp in the back of his truck, I have often wondered what truly happened after that door slammed shut. This story happened a few years ago during spring break in 2020, when I was 15 and home alone for the night while my parents were out of town. I was hanging out in my room when I got a call from a mutual friend from school, who I will call Mason, someone I rarely talked to, which already felt strange, but I answered anyway. Before I could even say anything, he asked what I was doing, and I told him I was just at home with nothing going on. Then he immediately asked if he could drop off one of my buddies, Neil, a friend I had known since 3rd grade, because Neil needed a place to stay for the night. I told Mason I really did not feel like having anyone over and just wanted to be alone, but he practically begged me, his voice sounding desperate as he pleaded with me to let Neil stay, and after I kept refusing, he finally offered to let me use his weed pen if I agreed. Stupidly, I caved and told him they could come over, not realizing at the time how bad of a decision that was. Neil had always been outgoing and had no filter, so when I heard from my brother and other friends the week before that he had been acting strangely in class, laughing or clapping randomly in silence and saying bizarre things like accusing the basketball coaches of being Freemasons trying to convert him, I did not take it as seriously as I should have. That changed the moment Mason and Neil arrived at my house. I greeted them at the door, hit Mason's weed pen like he promised, and as Mason was about to leave, he suddenly grabbed Neil by the shoulders, tears forming in his eyes, and begged him not to do that thing, to which Neil responded blankly that he understood. I did not ask what that meant and let Neil inside as Mason drove away, and immediately Neil asked if all the doors in the house were locked, which set off instant red flags in my head. I told him they were and showed him the back and laundry room doors, just to prove it. And after a few seconds of silence, he suddenly raised his hand, flashed an eerie, toothy smile, held it there for a moment, then dropped it without saying a word. I nervously laughed it off and followed him into the kitchen when he asked for water. But as I grabbed bottles from the fridge, I noticed him lingering by the silverware drawer, slowly opening it and reaching for a steak knife. Without thinking, I rushed over, grabbed his hand and slammed the drawer shut, and he simply stared at me and chuckled as if it were a joke, while my heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had never felt that kind of fear before, the kind you feel when you genuinely think your life might be in danger, and all I could think about was getting him out of my house. When he suggested we go to the neighborhood park, I agreed and led him toward the laundry room exit, intentionally letting him walk out first while I pretended to put on my shoes. Then I locked the door behind him and immediately called my brother. After that, I gathered every knife in the kitchen and brought them upstairs, knowing I needed to keep Neil from getting back inside, even though I was high and not thinking perfectly. My brother arrived within minutes with 3 friends, and while I stayed inside briefly, they talked to Neil, who was rambling about the basketball coaches being part of the Illuminati and claiming they would sexually assault players to make them better. Eventually, one of my friends took Neil home, despite Neil insisting his dad was going to kill him, and afterward I called Mason, who admitted that Neil had been reading a manifesto in the car about needing to kill himself or someone else to stop his dad from killing him, which explained Mason's panic and desperation earlier. I was furious that Mason dumped him at my house without warning me, even though I knew I was partly at fault for not asking questions, and later it came out that Neil had taken drugs that triggered schizophrenic episodes and auditory hallucinations. When I finally told my mom about it a month later, she was beyond upset, and to this day I still think about how close I came to something truly horrific that night. Knowing that if I had not paid attention to what Neil was doing in the kitchen, things could have ended very differently. I was 10 years old when this happened, on a warm, sunny afternoon when my mom went grocery shopping and asked if I wanted to come with her. And I made a big fuss about staying home because all I wanted to do was shoot hoops in the street. I promised her nothing bad would happen and reminded her she would only be gone for a couple of hours. And eventually she gave in and let me stay. As soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed the old basketball from the garage and started playing by myself, making up little games, pretending I was down by one and taking a buzzer-beater shot, running back and forth until I started sweating. At one point, I stopped to catch my breath, lazily bouncing the ball and looking around the neighborhood, and that was when I glanced up at the house and saw someone staring down at me from the upstairs window. At first, it was just a shadow behind the glass, like someone standing back from the sunlight, but after a second or two, the shape shifted, and I realized it was not a trick of the light. Someone was really up there watching me. No one was supposed to be home. My sister was away at college, my dad was at work, and my mom was across town. So I dropped the basketball without even meaning to. The window was my sister's room, the blinds half open, and all I could see was a figure with no clear features. Not knowing what else to do, I ran around the side of the house, through the backyard gate, and burst inside, slamming the door shut behind me, yelling up the stairs to ask who was home, my voice cracking as I shouted. For a moment there was silence, and then a voice answered from upstairs, calling my name and telling me to come upstairs. It was not my mom, my dad, or my sister. It was deeper than their voices, but not exaggerated, just someone trying to sound normal, and I stayed far away from the stairs. I ran straight through the house, grabbed the cordless phone from the kitchen counter, sprinted back outside and called my mom, telling her someone was inside the house. At first she thought I was joking and told me not to mess around, but when I started crying and begging her to believe me, telling her I heard someone call my name from inside and saw them at the upstairs window, she finally said she was leaving the store immediately. A police car arrived at the same time she pulled into the driveway, and she rushed over asking where I had seen the person, and I pointed to the upstairs window. The police went in first while I waited outside, staring at that window for 10 long minutes, until an officer finally came out and said it was safe to come inside. I showed them the room, and they searched everywhere, closets, under the bed, behind the dresser, even the attic, but they found nothing. And after they left, my mom acted unsure, saying she believed me, but warning me I would be punished if I had made it up. That night, I struggled to fall asleep, replaying the voice and the shadow behind the blinds, and when I finally drifted off, I woke up sometime later in the dark, thinking it was a bad dream until I heard a sound in my room. Sitting up, my eyes adjusted and I could see my dresser, the cracked closet door, my shelves, and then something else. A tall, dark shape standing completely still near my bed. The slightest movement confirmed it was a person, a full-grown man standing in my bedroom, and I screamed as loud as I could. The figure moved instantly, crossing the room in 2 steps, sliding my window open and jumping out onto the awning below, just as my parents burst in. My dad running to the window and then out the back door barefoot, only to return minutes later saying he saw no one. The police came again to file another report, but we never found out how long that man had been in the house. Long enough to know my name, long enough to watch me from my sister's window, and long enough to stand in my room while I slept. And not knowing what else he might have done is the most terrifying part of all.